The United States is carrying a financial burden unlike anything in modern history, a staggering $37 trillion in federal debt. And behind the carefully crafted language of official statements lies a truth most Americans never hear. The government isn't preparing to repay this mountain of obligations. It's preparing to shrink it. Not through spending cuts, not through higher taxes, but through a quieter, far more strategic mechanism: devaluation disguised as policy. And the tools at the center of this plan aren't what people expect. They are Bitcoin and gold, assets widely viewed as outside government control, now being quietly positioned as instruments for a new kind of monetary reset. We've seen the blueprint before. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt revalued gold overnight, instantly reducing America's real debt burden without ever using the word default. Today, Washington is preparing a more sophisticated version of the same move, built around accumulating digital and physical reserves and revaluing them at levels that transform the federal balance sheet. Executive orders, reserve disclosures, and shifting narratives around strategic assets all point in one direction: a potential repricing that strengthens the government's position while weakening anyone holding the US dollar. Because when hard assets are pushed upward, the dollar's purchasing power slides downward, quietly, legally, and almost invisibly. And if this reset unfolds, the cost won't fall on policymakers in Washington. It will fall on savers, retirees, and ordinary citizens across America and Europe who never realized their wealth was being used to lighten a $37 trillion burden. Understanding this hidden strategy is the only way to see what comes next. To understand how a strategy like this becomes possible, you first have to confront the scale of the crisis the United States is facing, because a nation doesn't consider rewriting the value of Bitcoin and gold unless every traditional path is already blocked by mathematical reality. The federal government now owes more than $37 trillion, and the country's debt-to-GDP ratio has climbed to 132%, a level so high that even optimistic projections show no plausible route back to stability through normal policy tools. Interest payments alone have exploded into a structural threat. More than $1.2 trillion a year today, projected to reach $1.8 trillion by 2027 if rates remain elevated. That means the United States could soon spend more on interest than it does on defense, Medicare, or anything except Social Security. And this isn't a one-time spike, it's a permanent drag, because the debt is growing faster than the economy powering it. You cannot tax your way out of this. The numbers don't work. You cannot cut spending enough without triggering political collapse. And you cannot grow fast enough when debt compounds at a speed the real economy cannot match. This is why governments facing unsustainable debt eventually turn to a tool individuals don't have: the power to redefine the value of their own currency. When a household is drowning in debt, it works more hours, sells assets, or tightens its budget. But when a government is drowning, it quietly adjusts the denominator, the dollar itself, making old obligations cheaper in real terms. Economists call this a monetary reset, but in practice, it's a controlled form of devaluation, a way to make debt appear smaller without ever paying it down. And history shows that when the numbers stop adding up, policymakers stop playing by the old rules. They look for mechanisms that don't resemble money printing, that don't alarm voters, and that don't cause immediate market panic. They search for a method that seems responsible on the surface while shifting the cost onto the public slowly, invisibly, and legally. That's where Bitcoin and gold enter the story, not as speculative assets, but as tools in a much larger effort to rebalance a national balance sheet that can no longer be saved by conventional means. What comes next is not about technology or ideology, it's about survival in a system where arithmetic has turned against the architects running it, pushing them towards strategies that fundamentally alter the value of the US dollar itself. To see how far the United States might be willing to go, you only need to look back at the last time Washington faced a debt spiral it couldn't escape. the infamous gold revaluation of 1933, which stands today as the clearest historical blueprint for how a government can erase debt without ever admitting it. In the early 1930s, the U.S. was suffocating under the weight of the Great Depression, collapsing revenues, and lingering obligations from World War I, with the federal debt-to-GDP ratio climbing toward 40% and deflation threatening to freeze the entire economy. In that environment, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made one of the most radical monetary decisions in modern history. Through Executive Order 6102, American citizens were required to surrender their privately held gold to the government at the official price of $20.67 per ounce, a price that had been fixed for more than half a century. Most people complied, believing they were contributing to national stability. But just months later, after the government had gathered the country's gold supply into federal vaults, Roosevelt announced a new official gold price of $35 per ounce, a stunning 69% revaluation overnight. This single administrative change instantly inflated the value of the Treasury's gold reserves from roughly $4 billion to nearly $7 billion, effectively creating billions in new asset value without mining a single additional ounce. More importantly, because the US dollar was still tied to gold at the time, revaluing gold automatically devalued the dollar, making the government's outstanding debt substantially cheaper in real terms. Within 5 years, the real federal debt burden fell from around 40% of GDP to just 25%, not because Washington paid the debt down, but because inflation, triggered by the revaluation, quietly eroded its true weight. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens who had handed over their gold at $20.67 watched its value soar to $35, but they could no longer buy it back. Private gold ownership had become illegal. They were trapped holding a currency that lost purchasing power year after year, subsidizing a national rescue operation they never agreed to. This episode isn't ancient trivia. It's the clearest demonstration of how governments confronted with impossible financial math can use the assets they control to rewrite the value of money itself. And the most unsettling part is how fast it happened. One executive order, one price change, and the entire monetary landscape shifted overnight. Today, the United States faces a debt burden far larger and more dangerous than the one Roosevelt confronted. And rather than gold alone, the modern government has access to a new pair of tools, Bitcoin and a massively undervalued gold reserve that could enable an even more powerful version of the same strategy. What Roosevelt did with physical gold in 1933, Washington could attempt with digital reserves and gold repricing in the 2020s, but on a scale that touches every saver in America and Europe. What makes the modern situation even more consequential than 1933 is that Washington now has access to not one but two powerful assets capable of reshaping its balance sheet: a massively undervalued gold reserve and an emerging pool of Bitcoin already under federal control, both of which can be strategically revalued in ways that mimic Roosevelt's playbook, but on a far grander scale. The United States officially holds roughly 8,133 tons of gold, equivalent to about 261 million ounces, a hoard valued at more than $700 billion at current market prices, near $2,800 per ounce. Yet on the federal balance sheet, this gold is still recorded at the outdated statutory price of $42.2022 per ounce, meaning the U.S. lists its entire gold stockpile as worth barely $11 billion, a figure so artificially low it creates enormous latent capacity for revaluation. This discrepancy is not an accounting oversight. It is an untouched lever, a reservoir of hidden strength waiting for the right moment. If Washington were to revalue its gold holdings to $10,000, $15,000, or even $20,000 per ounce, the official value of its reserves would instantly jump to between $2.6 trillion and $5.2 trillion, manufacturing trillions in asset value without raising taxes, cutting spending, or borrowing another dollar. This is exactly how Roosevelt engineered relief nearly a century ago, except now the numbers are exponentially larger. But gold is only half of the modern strategy. Over the past decade, the US government has quietly accumulated a surprisingly large cache of Bitcoin, primarily through criminal seizures tied to cases like the Silk Road, the Bitfinex hack, ransomware takedowns, and forfeiture agreements with major crypto firms. Estimates suggest the federal government already holds roughly 210,000 BTC, and new legislative proposals, such as the Bitcoin Reserve Bill introduced by Senator Cynthia Lummis, outline a roadmap for the US to acquire up to 1 million Bitcoin over several years, a staggering accumulation that could transform the federal balance sheet. Crucially, the government isn't buying this Bitcoin on the open market. Doing so would drive prices sharply higher and make large-scale acquisition prohibitively expensive. Instead, it is gathering BTC through seizures, settlements, custodial transfers, and potentially through strategic mining operations linked to federal energy infrastructure. This allows the US to increase its holdings quietly, cheaply, and without disrupting markets. The same covert approach Roosevelt used when he collected the nation's gold at $20.67 per ounce before revaluing it to $35. If the US manages to accumulate 1 million BTC at an average effective cost near $120,000, the total investment would be around $120 billion. But if the government later declares a reserve revaluation, valuing Bitcoin at $500,000 or $1 million for official accounting purposes, the paper value of those holdings would explode to $500 billion or $1 trillion, creating vast new assets that could be used to offset America's debt burden. Just like with gold, price setting at the sovereign level doesn't stay confined to spreadsheets. Markets tend to follow because governments with the largest holdings effectively set the floor. When the biggest player in the world declares a strategic valuation, financial systems adjust around it, whether gradually or suddenly, and the ripple effects would be profound. If the US were to push a dual revaluation, gold toward $20,000 per ounce and Bitcoin toward $1 million, two things would happen simultaneously. The government's balance sheet would strengthen by trillions of dollars, and the US dollar would lose significant purchasing power. Because when hard assets are revalued upward, it is not that they suddenly become more valuable in some absolute sense. It is that the currency used to measure them becomes weaker. A gold revaluation from $1,800 to $20,000 implies an 85% devaluation of the dollar relative to gold. A Bitcoin jump from $100,000 to $1 million implies a 90% devaluation relative to digital hard money. Most Americans do not think in terms of gold or Bitcoin. They think in terms of groceries, rent, healthcare, and fuel. But those prices are just expressions of the value of the US dollar. If gold and Bitcoin climb because the government repositions them as strategic assets, the cost of everyday life would rise swiftly and relentlessly. A carton of eggs doubling in price, gas stations posting numbers that seem surreal today, rents jumping 40-60%, and wages lagging far behind. This is what devaluation looks like in real terms. And all of this could unfold without a single law explicitly stating we are devaluing the currency. It would be presented as modernization, financial stability, strategic leadership in digital assets, or a return to sound money principles. In reality, it would be a calculated transfer of wealth from anyone holding dollars, bonds, or cash savings to the federal government, which would emerge with a balance sheet strengthened by artificially boosted asset valuations. The very mechanism that appears to fortify national solvency would quietly hollow out the middle class. And the unsettling truth is that every component of this strategy, from the undervalued gold reserve to the expanding federal Bitcoin holdings, is already in place. The only missing piece is the moment of execution. If there is a moment when this strategy becomes unavoidable, it will follow a timeline that is already taking shape. A sequence of events that echoes historical resets while adapting them to the economic and political landscape of the 2020s. And when viewed together, the pattern points toward a window between 2025 and 2027 in which the United States could quietly shift the foundations of the global financial system. The first stage is the accumulation phase, unfolding throughout 2025, during which the government continues gathering Bitcoin through seizures, settlements, and discrete transfers, while signaling renewed interest in America's massive gold position through policy discussions about sound money, strategic reserves, and modernized backing. None of this triggers alarm, because the steps appear technical, administrative, and incremental. Then comes the crisis phase in 2026, the most critical part of the sequence, where rising interest costs, another contentious debt ceiling standoff, and increasing stress in the Treasury bond market begin to undermine global confidence. When yields spike and headlines warn of potential downgrades or default risks, the environment becomes ripe for extraordinary measures. Historically, governments never pursue radical monetary shifts in calm periods. They wait for, or accept, crisis conditions that make drastic action seem responsible rather than disruptive. This crisis becomes the justification for what follows in 2027, the revaluation phase, when Washington could unveil a dual announcement: the activation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a modernized framework for the US dollar, partially backed by revalued gold. The government would not call it devaluation, it would call it stabilization, modernization, or restoration. But the effect would be unmistakable. Bitcoin could be officially valued at $500,000 or $1 million, and gold could be placed at $10,000 or $20,000 for reserve accounting. Markets would adjust around these signals, hard assets would surge, and the US dollar would weaken sharply in real terms. By 2028-2030, the system would enter the stabilization phase, where the dust settles around new price plateaus: gold at $15,000, $18,000, Bitcoin at $500,000, ounce or $800,000, and the dollar operating with permanently reduced purchasing power. The government's balance sheet would look stronger, but the average American and millions across Europe would feel the consequences in rent, food, energy, and wages. The reset would be complete. Not declared, not voted on, but expressed through the silent mathematics of revaluation. When a reset of this scale unfolds, the most important question isn't whether the government's balance sheet improves, it's who pays the price. Because every monetary transformation in modern history has produced the same two groups: those who benefit from the revaluation and those who unknowingly absorb its cost. And in a scenario where Bitcoin and gold are thrust upward to shrink a $37 trillion burden, the dividing line becomes brutally clear. On one side are the winners, the US government, which instantly reduces the real weight of its debt; the policymakers in Washington, who avoid the political suicide of cutting Social Security or raising taxes; and the early holders of gold or Bitcoin, whose assets appreciate dramatically as the dollar weakens. Even foreign powers like China, Russia, and India, nations that have accumulated massive gold reserves, would benefit, watching their own balance sheets strengthen as a global repricing lifts the value of their holdings. Wealthy Americans with significant exposure to real assets, whether real estate, commodity-linked businesses, or equity in firms that can raise prices, would also emerge relatively intact. But the losers form a much larger, much more vulnerable group: ordinary savers in the United States and across Europe, retirees living on fixed incomes, workers whose wages trail behind inflation, anyone holding US Treasuries, and the vast network of pension funds, insurance companies, and retirement accounts that depend on those bonds retaining their real value. A revaluation-driven devaluation would cut the purchasing power of the US dollar by 50–70% in real terms, even if it is framed publicly as financial modernization or stabilizing reform. That means rent surging while wages stagnate, groceries doubling while savings accounts remain flat, and fixed-income retirees suffering the harshest blow as their monthly checks buy less and less. It is a transfer of wealth from the middle class to the state, a shift not labeled as taxation, but functioning like one, precise in its impact, yet invisible in its execution. History provides painful parallels. Weimar Germany, Argentina in the 1980s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela in the 2010s. In every case, governments facing impossible debt loads turned to the same tool: devaluation disguised as policy. Each time, the elites with access to hard assets survived or prospered, while the middle class saw decades of savings evaporate. The United States would not be an exception. It would be a more technologically sophisticated version of the same dynamic. And when the dust settles, the wealth gap would widen dramatically, not because of greed or speculation, but because the very currency defining everyday life had been quietly rewritten. This is the real consequence of a Bitcoin gold reset, not the headline numbers, but the silent erosion of the American and European middle class, whose trust in the stability of the dollar becomes the very fuel for its devaluation. And this is why understanding the mechanics behind a potential Bitcoin gold revaluation isn't a matter of curiosity, it's a matter of survival. Because if a monetary reset is the only remaining path for Washington to manage a $37 trillion burden, the people least prepared will face the greatest impact, not through sudden collapse, but through a slow, grinding erosion of purchasing power that feels like life simply getting harder every year. What makes this moment different from past crises is how quietly the architecture is being built. Executive discussions about strategic reserves, proposals for a Bitcoin accumulation program, renewed debate over America's 8,133 tons of gold, and a bond market showing early signs of stress. None of these signals alone confirm a reset, but together they outline a trajectory that mirrors every historical period where governments used revaluation to rewrite the value of their obligations. And while officials will frame any shift as modernization, stabilization, or leadership in digital finance, the underlying reality remains the same. Revaluing hard assets upward is simply another way of pushing the US dollar downward. For the government, it's a solution. For ordinary savers, it's a silent tax paid without consent. The world's central banks aren't waiting to see what happens. They are already buying record amounts of gold, diversifying away from dollars, and preparing for volatility. The question is whether individuals will prepare with the same clarity. No one can predict the exact year or the exact trigger, but history is unequivocal. When debt becomes unmanageable, currencies change. And when currencies change, those who understand the shift early endure it, while those who ignore it are consumed by it.